Hi, this is Kelly Phillips for PaperBeadRollers.com. In today's tutorial, we're going to talk about 2 common methods to glaze your paper beads. Glazing is the last step in making a paper bead. There are several reasons why you need to glaze your beads. First of all, paper isn't the sturdiest material in the world. It's going to bend and tear and absorb oils from your skin, or disintegrate if it gets wet. The goal of glazing is to create a protective layer around the bead that will make the bead stronger, repel water and skin oils, and even make the beads cleanable to a point. Glazing does not make the beads waterproof. They will still be damaged if they're submerged in water, but it does make them water repellent. The second reason to glaze your beads is for the shine. Glazing gives the beads a beautiful glossy surface that makes them look nice. The more coats of glaze you put on a bead, the more it fills in the ridges and dips in the surface, and the more plastic or glassy the beads look. You can choose glazes with high gloss or matte to achieve different looks. There are many methods for glazing beads. In this video, we're going to discuss 2 of them. Both methods involve glazing one bead at a time. In method 1, we'll use a liquid glaze and brush it on our bead. In method 2, we'll use a powder and heat to glaze our beads. First, we'll look at method 1, the liquid glaze. For this method, I'm using a product called Judikins Diamond Glaze. After testing quite a few brands of glaze, I found Diamond Glaze to be the winner because of its hardening properties and its fast drying time. Step 1 is to get a small dish and put just a little bit of glaze in it. You'll also need a paintbrush. I prefer a small brush with pliable bristles. You need to be able to control where the glaze is being applied to the bead, so choose a brush that works for you. You'll also need some type of rod to hold the beads while they dry. I use a bamboo skewer, or for beads with smaller diameter holes, I'll even use a toothpick. Choose a rod close to the size of the bead hole so that the bead doesn't slide around too easily. The next step is to paint the glaze on the bead. Make sure that you fully covered the surface of the bead and don't leave any of the paper exposed. Be careful to cover to the edge of the bead, but don't paint glaze onto the bamboo rod. If you do, your bead may become glued to the rod and be ruined. If you need to, stay away from the edge and paint those edges last after the rest of the bead has dried and you've removed it from the rod. Let the beads completely dry before you add a second coat. I generally wait between 10 and 20 minutes depending on the humidity levels. Higher humidity slows down the drying. That's it for method 1. Now method 2, where we'll glaze with embossing powder and heat. For method 2, you'll need some embossing powder. My favorite is from a company out of the UK called Wow Embossing Powder. They make some beautiful colors that you could also use on beads. For this demonstration, we're just using the clear. You can use a bamboo skewer for this, but I actually use my bead roller. You'll need something to make the powder stick to the bead. I have this Versamark stamp pad. Wow also has an embossing ink that does a great job. And finally, you'll need a heat tool. The one that I use is Wagner, and I'll link the exact model in the video description. I'm sometimes asked if a hairdryer will work for this. A hairdryer will not work. The airflow is too strong and it will blow your embossing powder everywhere. The first step is to roll the bead onto the embossing ink pad, making sure that the surface of the bead is completely covered. Now this is why I use my bead roller to emboss. The bead will fit tightly onto the winding pin so I can really press it into the ink and get some good coverage. You may notice that my ink pad is a little bit discolored. That's from the dye in the paper of the bead transferring onto the ink pad. When you first get a pad like this, it should be completely white. The ink transfer doesn't really cause any issues. It's perfectly fine. Next, dip the bead right into the embossing powder and cover it completely with a layer of powder. Now some people will hold the bead over a dish and spoon the embossing powder onto it. I feel like that's an extra step and some extra cleanup, so I just dip it right in. Tap off the bead to get any powder out of the bead hole and to knock off any excess powder on the surface. If you don't do this, you will see powder go flying across your room when you apply the heat gun. As long as you tap it off, you'll be fine. Turn your heat gun on and warm it up for a few seconds. Then point it at the bead, holding it a few inches away. If you get too close or hold it in one place too long, the powder will burn instead of melt. If you see it start to bubble, back off a little bit. Make sure that you have good lighting so that you can really see the powder melt, and make sure that you get it all. Keep turning your bead and moving the gun until you've melted all of the powder. If you want to do a second coat, re-dip the bead into the powder before the first coat is completely cool. It'll stay sticky for a short time so that you can do this. When you're finished, give it just a few seconds to cool and you can pop it right off the bead roller. I usually wipe my bead roller with a baby wipe to make sure no glaze dries on it. Which method do I prefer? Well, you can see by looking at the two beads side by side that they both look great. There's not a significant difference in the glossiness or even the hardness of the beads. I personally prefer to use the embossing powder method. I feel like it's a little bit faster and a little less tedious than painting each bead individually. However, there is one drawback to this method. I have found that certain papers will absorb the embossing powder quite a bit, and it changes the color of the paper. Now, sometimes that's fine, and sometimes I don't want the color of the paper to change. Also, if there's any glue residue on the outside of the bead from when you originally rolled it, the embossing powder doesn't absorb into those areas, but then it does absorb into others, and it creates kind of an odd pattern on the beads. I use both methods depending on which project I'm working on. I hope this tutorial helped you determine the best way to glaze your beads. For more paper bead rolling tips and tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel on YouTube.